Have you ever wondered what really happens to the person who always needed to be in control, the very second they finally realize they control nothing anymore? What if the one who acted untouchable, confident, and completely unaffected is now standing face to face with a reality they never prepared for? Because what you're about to hear might completely change the way you understand this kind of behavior. Stick with me here, because this is not basic advice. This is the truth behind the mask. If you have ever dealt with someone like this, you will recognize every single line. And if you stay to the very end, you will understand exactly why walking away was the most powerful move you could have made for yourself. Now let's get into it. The loss of control is often one of the most psychologically destabilizing things that can happen to someone with this kind of personality, and the reason is simple. Control is not just something they enjoy, it is something they depend on to keep their sense of security and self-worth from falling apart. In many of these relationships, they grow used to predicting how the other person will respond. They expect access. They expect attention. They expect emotional reactions, forgiveness, and continued availability no matter what they do. Over time, this predictability creates a feeling of authority. They begin to believe that no matter what happens, the other person will remain emotionally connected and within reach. Stay with me because this part sets up everything that comes next. When someone finally walks away and holds firm boundaries, that sense of certainty suddenly disappears. The individual can no longer predict what the other person is thinking, feeling, or doing. They lose the ability to influence conversations, trigger emotional reactions, or shape the story of the relationship itself. This loss of influence creates intense discomfort because it removes a source of psychological stability they may have relied on for years. What makes this especially hard is that they often read independence as a threat rather than as a normal part of any healthy human relationship. The moment a former partner becomes emotionally unavailable, begins making decisions without them, and stops seeking their approval, the other side is forced to face a reality they struggle to accept. They are no longer the center of that person's emotional world, and this realization can trigger frustration, anger, anxiety, obsessive thinking, and repeated attempts to regain contact or reestablish influence. The distress is usually less about losing love and more about losing the ability to control access, attention, and emotional outcomes. When that control disappears, it can expose insecurities and fears that had previously stayed hidden beneath a carefully maintained sense of superiority. Their identity is often heavily dependent on external validation because their sense of self is not as stable or internally grounded as it may appear from the outside. While they may project confidence, certainty, and self-assurance to the world, much of that image is frequently held up by the reactions of other people. Praise, admiration, attention, recognition, and even strong emotional responses can serve as evidence that they are important, desirable, powerful, or superior. Rather than generating a consistent feeling of worth from inside, they often rely on others to reinforce that belief repeatedly, and that dependence can affect almost every area of their life. In relationships, they may constantly seek reassurance, admiration, or emotional investment from partners. In social settings, they may become highly focused on status, appearance, achievements, or the impressions they create around them. Even small criticism can feel disproportionately threatening because it challenges the image they work hard to keep intact. Positive attention strengthens that image, while rejection, indifference, or loss of admiration can create significant emotional discomfort. When a person who once provided that validation steps away, they may experience more than the loss of a relationship. They may lose a source of psychological reinforcement that helped hold their self-image together. Suddenly, the compliments, attention, emotional reactions, and availability they once counted on are no longer guaranteed, and this can create feelings of insecurity, anxiety, frustration, or even fixation. They may search for new sources of validation, attempt to regain old ones, or become preoccupied with proving their value to others in the hopes of filling the empty space. The deeper issue is not simply about wanting attention. It is about a deep reliance on external approval to keep a sense of identity, significance, and emotional stability in place when there is hidden self-doubt underneath. No contact creates psychological pressure because it removes the channels through which this kind of person typically maintains a feeling of influence, awareness, and emotional control. In many relationships, they grow used to having access to the other person's thoughts, feelings, reactions, and daily life. Whether through direct communication, social media, mutual friends, or ongoing conflict, those connections provide information and reassurance that they still occupy an important spot in that person's world. Even negative reactions can serve a purpose because they confirm that an emotional connection still exists. And as long as something is happening, it feels like proof that they still matter. When no contact is established and consistently maintained, that flow of information suddenly stops. They no longer know what the other person is doing, who they are spending time with, how they feel, or whether they are even thinking about the relationship anymore. This uncertainty can become deeply uncomfortable because it removes predictability. The individual who once seemed fully accessible becomes psychologically out of reach, and that lack of access often generates growing curiosity and frustration. The pressure builds because silence leaves room for unanswered questions that have nowhere to go. Without communication, they cannot easily test their influence, seek reassurance, defend their image, or shape the story. They may begin wondering whether they have been forgotten, replaced, or permanently removed from the other person's life. And the absence of feedback can feel even more threatening than direct rejection because there is nothing concrete to respond to or challenge. As a result, no contact often forces them to sit with uncertainty that they would normally try to avoid. The inability to monitor, manipulate, persuade, or provoke a response can trigger anxiety, anger, obsessive thinking, and repeated attempts to regain access. The psychological pressure comes from losing both information and influence at the same time, leaving them unable to restore the familiar dynamics that once gave them a sense of control. The ego begins to crack when the carefully constructed image they have built can no longer be consistently supported by external reality. Much of their psychological stability depends on keeping a belief that they are exceptional, desirable, important, or in control, and this self-image often acts as a protective shield against deeper feelings of inadequacy, insecurity, shame, or vulnerability that quietly sit underneath. If this is hitting home, leave a comment below with the word "found" because I want to know you are still watching. As long as they continue receiving validation, admiration, attention, or compliance from others, that shield holds strong and the underlying doubts stay largely hidden. However, when a major source of validation is removed, especially after someone walks away and refuses to re-engage, cracks begin to appear in that protective structure. They start running into evidence that challenges the assumptions they have about themselves. The person they expected to come back does not return. The individual they believe needed them continues moving forward independently. The influence they once relied on becomes less effective or disappears entirely. These experiences create a collision between the image they hold of themselves and the reality unfolding around them, and that internal conflict can be deeply unsettling because it forces them to confront questions they would normally avoid at all costs. If they are as powerful as they believed, why can they no longer control the situation? If they are as unforgettable as they imagined, why is someone thriving without them? These questions are deeply uncomfortable because they threaten the grandiose self-perception that helps them feel secure in the first place. As the pressure grows, emotional reactions often become stronger. Mood swings, defensiveness, irritability, obsessive thinking, and heightened sensitivity to criticism may emerge. The individual may try harder to seek validation, rewrite the story, blame others, or regain control in any way that they can. Beneath all of these behaviors sits a growing struggle to keep their idealized self-image intact while evidence continues to challenge it, exposing vulnerabilities they have spent years trying to keep hidden. The first cracks are often the most important moment to watch. Obsession replaces certainty when someone loses the confidence that they still have influence over a person they once believed would always remain emotionally available. During the relationship, they may have felt secure in the assumption that they understood the other person's feelings, reactions, and future behavior. They often expected that no matter how much distance was created, they would still occupy a significant place in that person's mind. This certainty gave them a sense of control and predictability that helped hold up their self-image. When that certainty disappears, it leaves behind a psychological void that feels almost impossible to fill. The person who walked away is no longer responding, no longer explaining, no longer defending, and no longer providing emotional feedback. Instead of receiving confirmation that they still matter, they are left with unanswered questions that keep circling in their own head. They may begin wondering what the other person is thinking, whether they have moved on, whether someone else has taken their place, or whether they are even being remembered at all. The lack of information becomes increasingly hard to tolerate, and as a result, thoughts about the former partner become more frequent and intrusive. They may replay past conversations, revisit memories, analyze events, or search for subtle clues that might explain what happened. They may quietly monitor social media, ask mutual acquaintances for small bits of information, or create entire scenarios in their mind to fill the gaps left by uncertainty. What was once a position of confidence gradually turns into a state of preoccupation. The fixation is often not really driven by love, emotional intimacy, or genuine concern. More often, it is fueled by the deep discomfort of not knowing, and while human beings naturally seek closure and understanding, for someone who relies heavily on control, that kind of uncertainty can feel especially threatening. The inability to predict, influence, or access the other person's inner world slowly transforms confidence into fixation, creating a cycle of rumination that becomes increasingly difficult to break free from. Replacement supply often fails because a new relationship cannot automatically solve the emotional and psychological issues that already existed before the previous one ended. Many people assume that when someone like this quickly moves on to a new partner, it means they have fully recovered, forgotten the past, or found something better. In reality, the new relationship frequently serves as a temporary source of validation rather than a genuine resolution of the deeper insecurities that have been there for years. At the very beginning, a new partner may provide attention, admiration, excitement, and emotional investment, and this can create a powerful sense of relief because it restores many of the things they feel they lost. The admiration supports their self-image. The novelty distracts them from feelings of rejection, loss, or uncertainty. For a short period of time, this can make it look like everything is finally fine. However, the underlying psychological needs that existed before often remain completely unchanged. The need for constant validation, the fear of losing control, the sensitivity to criticism, and the dependence on external approval does not simply vanish because a new person has entered the picture. As the new relationship becomes more familiar and the initial excitement fades, the new partner inevitably becomes a real human being rather than an idealized source of admiration. Real differences appear, expectations develop, and small imperfections become visible. When this happens, the same insecurities that existed in the previous relationship can resurface. They may begin seeking more attention, become dissatisfied, or feel threatened when the new partner no longer provides endless validation, and that is when the mask really starts to slip. Anger and desperation often increase together because both emotions tend to emerge from the same underlying experience. The loss of control, validation, and certainty can feel overwhelming when it hits all at once. When the individual realizes that someone they once influenced is no longer responding in predictable ways, they may experience a powerful sense of frustration. The anger comes from the fact that reality is no longer matching their expectations. The desperation comes from a growing awareness that their usual methods of regaining influence may not be working anymore. These two emotional states can exist at the same time, creating a confusing and often intense pattern of behavior that is hard for anyone on the outside to fully understand. The anger is frequently directed outward. They may blame the former partner, criticize them, spread negative stories, or quietly portray themselves as the victim of everything that happened. This reaction helps protect their image because it shifts responsibility away from themselves and onto someone else. Admitting that another person has chosen to move forward independently can feel deeply uncomfortable because it challenges their belief in their own importance and influence. At the same time, desperation may begin operating beneath the surface. The individual may become increasingly preoccupied with regaining access to the person who left. They may attempt unexpected contact, seek information through mutual acquaintances, monitor social media activity, or look for any opportunity to quietly reinsert themselves into the other person's life. These efforts are often driven by a strong desire to restore certainty and reduce the discomfort created by emotional distance. Because anger and desperation feed each other, the emotional cycle can become more intense over time. The more unsuccessful their attempts to regain influence become, the more frustrated they may feel, and the more frustrated they feel, the stronger the urge becomes to regain control of the situation. This can result in unpredictable shifts between hostility, nostalgia, blame, charm, self-pity, and sudden attempts at reconciliation, all reflecting an internal struggle to cope with a reality they find difficult to accept. The real crisis is internal because the deepest challenge is often not the loss of a specific relationship, but the confrontation with parts of themselves they have spent years avoiding altogether. Many behaviors on display here are designed to protect a fragile sense of self from feelings of inadequacy, shame, rejection, or vulnerability. By focusing on achievement, admiration, status, control, or external validation, they can keep these uncomfortable emotions pushed firmly into the background. As long as that protective system keeps functioning, they may rarely need to examine what really lies beneath it. When a significant source of validation is removed, especially after someone leaves and refuses to return, that protective structure can begin to weaken. The attention, admiration, emotional investment, or sense of control that once helped maintain stability is no longer available, and without those external supports, uncomfortable emotions may become much harder to ignore. Feelings of insecurity, self-doubt, loneliness, inadequacy, or fear can begin moving closer to the surface. And what makes this crisis particularly difficult is that it cannot be fully resolved through external solutions. Finding a new relationship, gaining more attention, achieving new success, or receiving praise may provide temporary relief, but these things do not actually address the underlying emotional wounds that have been quietly building for years. The individual may continue searching outside themselves for answers, while the real source of distress remains locked away inside. As a result, they may experience growing inner tension. On one side sits the desire to maintain the image of strength, superiority, and control. On the other side sits the reality of unresolved emotional pain and vulnerability. The conflict between these two forces creates real psychological strain that steadily grows heavier with time. The more they attempt to avoid self-examination, the more energy is required to hold the protective image in place, making the internal struggle increasingly difficult to escape or silence. The most important thing to understand is that when someone with these patterns appears to be approaching a psychological breaking point, the real battle is rarely about losing a relationship alone. It is about losing control, losing certainty, losing validation, and being forced to face aspects of themselves they have spent years trying to avoid. What looks like anger, obsession, replacement relationships, blame, or desperate attempts to regain influence is often part of a much deeper internal struggle that has simply been unable to stay hidden anymore. The collapse does not begin the moment someone walks away. It begins when the strategies that once protected their self-image quietly stop working, and reality becomes impossible to ignore any further. For the person who left, this is a powerful reminder that healing is not about proving anything, not about seeking revenge, and not about waiting for the other person to finally understand the damage they caused. Healing is about reclaiming your own peace, your own voice, and your own future without needing permission from anyone who only ever valued your presence as a mirror for their own ego. If this resonated with you, like the video, subscribe for more, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth today. While human beings naturally seek closure and meaningful understanding in their lives, for someone who relies so heavily on external control, that kind of uncertainty can feel especially threatening and difficult to sit with for very long. The inability to predict, to influence, or to access the other person's inner world slowly transforms what used to be confidence into quiet fixation, creating an endless cycle of rumination that becomes increasingly difficult to break free from without some kind of external intervention happening. Replacement supply often fails because a brand new relationship cannot automatically solve all the emotional and psychological issues that already existed long before the previous one ever ended. Many people wrongly assume that when this kind of person quickly moves on to a brand new partner, it means they have fully recovered from the past, completely forgotten what happened, or finally found something far better than what they lost. In reality, the new relationship frequently serves as nothing more than a temporary source of validation rather than a genuine resolution of the deeper insecurities that have quietly lived inside them for years. At the very beginning of any new connection, a fresh partner may provide plenty of admiration, attention, excitement, and emotional investment. And this can create a powerful and immediate sense of relief because it temporarily restores many of the things they felt they had lost forever. The steady attention reassures them on some level that they are still desirable to other people. The admiration quietly supports their fragile self-image. The novelty and excitement help distract them from deep feelings of rejection, painful loss, and heavy uncertainty that never really left. For a short window of time, this can make everything appear as though it is finally working and everything is going to be just fine. However, the underlying psychological needs that existed long before this new person arrived often remain completely unchanged and untouched by anything new happening on the surface. The deep need for constant validation, the quiet fear of losing control over another person, the intense sensitivity to even small criticism, and the ongoing dependence on external approval does not simply vanish into thin air just because a brand new person has entered the picture. As the new relationship slowly becomes more familiar and comfortable, and the initial excitement quietly fades away into routine, the new partner inevitably becomes a real human being with real flaws rather than an idealized source of endless admiration. Real differences of opinion begin to surface. Unmet expectations quietly develop, and small imperfections become painfully visible to both people involved. When this natural process begins to happen, the exact same insecurities that quietly existed in the previous relationship can begin to quietly resurface in the new one as well. They may begin seeking even more attention, become quietly dissatisfied with the emotional investment they receive, or feel strangely threatened when the new partner no longer provides the endless stream of validation they had grown used to so quickly. This is the exact moment when the carefully constructed mask really begins to visibly slip in ways that other people around them start to notice for the first time. Anger and desperation often increase together over time because both of these intense emotions tend to emerge from the exact same underlying experience happening underneath. The sudden loss of control, the loss of validation, and the loss of all certainty can feel completely overwhelming when these three things hit all at the same moment in their life. When the individual finally realizes that someone they once influenced so heavily is no longer responding to them in the predictable ways they had grown used to, they may experience a powerful and rising sense of deep frustration that they cannot easily release. The anger itself comes from the painful fact that reality is no longer matching the expectations they had quietly built up in their own mind. The desperation quietly comes from a growing and uncomfortable awareness that their usual methods of regaining lost influence may no longer be working the way they used to work in the past. These two heavy emotional states can easily exist at the exact same time inside the same person, creating a confusing, intense, and often contradictory pattern of behavior that is genuinely hard for anyone on the outside looking in to fully understand or explain to others. The anger is frequently directed outward toward the people around them. They may quietly blame the former partner for everything that went wrong, harshly criticize them to anyone who will listen, spread negative and distorted stories about what happened, or quietly portray themselves as the innocent victim of everything that took place between the two of you. This kind of reaction helps protect their fragile image because it cleverly shifts responsibility away from their own actions and quietly onto someone else's shoulders. Admitting to themselves that another person has chosen to move forward independently without them can feel deeply uncomfortable because it directly challenges their deeply held belief in their own lasting importance and personal influence over others. At the exact same time, quiet desperation may begin operating just beneath the visible surface of their behavior in ways that other people may not even notice right away. The individual may become increasingly preoccupied with regaining even the smallest amount of access to the person who left their life. They may attempt unexpected and unannounced contact through various channels, seek out small bits of information through mutual acquaintances who still talk to both parties, quietly monitor your social media activity for any sign of change, or look for any small opportunity to reinsert themselves into your daily life without your permission or invitation. These subtle efforts are often driven by a powerful and ongoing desire to restore some sense of certainty and significantly reduce the deep internal discomfort created by the mounting emotional distance between you. Because quiet anger and quiet desperation feed into each other in a slow but powerful loop, the emotional cycle can gradually become far more intense over time than it was at the very beginning of the separation. The more unsuccessful their attempts to regain their lost influence become, the more frustrated they may quietly feel inside, and the more frustrated they feel, the stronger and more urgent the urge becomes to regain any kind of control back over the unfolding situation. This unhealthy loop can result in unpredictable and confusing shifts between sudden hostility, brief moments of nostalgia, persistent blame, charming behavior, exaggerated self-pity, and sudden attempts at superficial reconciliation, all of which quietly reflect an ongoing internal struggle to cope with a reality they find deeply difficult to accept on any level. The real crisis happening here is purely internal, because the deepest challenge for someone like this is often not the visible loss of a specific romantic relationship. It is the painful confrontation with parts of themselves that they have quietly spent years avoiding altogether through every defense mechanism they have learned to use. Many of their most visible behaviors are quietly designed to protect an extremely fragile sense of self from overwhelming feelings of personal inadequacy, deep shame, painful rejection, or quiet vulnerability that they cannot bring themselves to face. By focusing all their energy on achieving more, collecting admiration, chasing status, maintaining control over others, or seeking constant external validation, they can quietly keep these uncomfortable and deeply painful emotions pushed firmly into the background of their daily awareness.